say welcome to everybody and hello. Thanks a lot for joining us for this BetterUX event, where we're going to be looking at how to scale your UX research capability to deliver exceptional digital experiences. We have a really, I think, inspiring agenda and inspiring speakers today, and I will introduce those to you momentarily. For those of you, if this is your first BetterUX Summit, welcome. For those of you that's not your first one, welcome back. We run these every 3 months, approximately, and our aim is to showcase the latest thinking and thought leadership and best practice around UX research and design. And today we're very much focusing on how companies can mature their UX research practice and scale it at the same time. And we've got some really, really strong speakers. But before we get started, just a very small point. At the bottom of your screen, you should see a Q&A button. And guess what? If you press that, you can you can ask us a question and we'll endeavor to answer it. I'd strongly suggest that you do that while the talks are going on. No need to wait to the end. We'll answer the questions at the end. But if you can ask as you think of the questions, then that would be really great. And we'll capture all of those and answer as many as we can. And we're recording this session. So in the future, we will send out a recording to you. We'll send out a post-event survey as well, so you can tell us how to improve, as well as other materials that we'll cover in today's session. So before I hand over to the speakers and introduce them, I wanted to just kind of set the scene when it comes to UX maturity by looking at a survey that we ran approximately 6 months ago around the state of UX, and taking a look at some three key insights from that. We ran it with 700 digital professionals from across the world. And here are 3 things that we found that I think are really, really interesting and relevant to today's summit topic. So 70% of respondents said that demand for UX research has increased over the past year. So for those of us that have been working in UX research for some years, that of course is great to hear. Finally, perhaps the businesses are starting to see some, and I know that they are, value in UX research. And for a quarter of people that responded, that was a significant increase in demand for UX research. So that's all great, a very positive thing. But what's really interesting, alongside that 45% of respondents said that their budgets had remained the same, hadn't necessarily increased. So I think there's a potential there that there could be somewhat of a gap between demand for UX research and supply. That's the first insight I wanted to cover. The second was around the most common ways that leadership evaluate UX. So we asked some questions around this, and it seems that customer satisfaction, business metrics, and product and site analytics were kind of the top 3 ways that UX was evaluated. And I don't think anybody would disagree that UX doesn't have an impact on customer satisfaction, business metrics like conversion rates, and product and site analytics, and sales and reduced costs. All of that, I think, to anybody on this call is pretty obvious. But I think when we think about if these are the ways that we're measuring digital UX, they're not necessarily a direct reflection of how users react to digital experiences or how we should improve them. We're not directly measuring UX, we're looking at the outcomes of UX, which is not a bad thing to do. That should help us secure budget, but is not necessarily the best way to go about it. I'll give you a very short example, short case study. So that brings this point to life. So probably more than 5 years ago, we were running a test of and I won't name them, of a low-cost airline site in the UK. And at the time, this site was renowned for having lots of dark patterns. So ways of tricking or tripping up end users so they accidentally bought, I don't know, travel insurance or extra baggage for their flights when they didn't really need them. And we saw, through observing people across multiple usability tests, both some quantitative and some qualitative ones as well, that there was no trust in the site experience. There was it was really, really confusing, and purposefully so, to trick people into buying things they didn't need. And yet the NPS score, which would be a score of customer satisfaction for that site, was really, really high. So really bad usability, really poor UX, but a very high NPS score. And when we investigated that, when we got into it, people said their NPS score, they would recommend this site and this brand to their friends and family and colleagues simply because they were the cheapest. They would tolerate that really poor UX and usability because they were the cheapest. So just a quick example of how using something like NPS alone is not necessarily giving us a great view of digital experiences, or a good way to measure them. The third insight, and for me, if we think about the overall maturity of UX research at the moment, this is probably the most the best way to look at overall digital maturity is how UX research is being used in organizations. It's being used a lot to identify usability issues and to validate or test designs. That tends to be where a lot of people start when it comes to running UX research. But there's much less being done on the kind of strategic end of things, to actually, rather than react to what products are doing, but to actually drive product strategy and innovation, or even, and back to that point about how we measure UX, or even measure UX performance against competitors as well. So in summary, what do these mean? Well, I think they mean that that we may be great from a practitioner, just speaking broadly, we may be great practitioners, but I think we have some way to go to maturing UX research within our own organizations and more broadly as well. And why do I say that? Well, the businesses are starting to see value in UX research, but we've not done the best job at securing budgets. The business is starting to understand the outcomes of UX research, but isn't directly measuring it. And we tend to start with and haven't moved on massively from running tactical research rather than strategic research that is changing culture and creating customer centricity within organizations. We're going to share more insights from BetterUX with you after this event. And you should see that in your email over the next couple of days. But now I'd like to kind of, from that macro view of UX research maturity, come down to more of a micro view and introduce Terry and Tom Hayes. Terry is product design manager at Gusto, and she's joined by Tom Hayes, who is one of our research partners at UserZoom, and he advises our customers how to improve their UX practice. So Terry and Tom, if you guys would like to join the session now, I will hand it over to you two to take it away.
Brilliant. Thanks, Lee. Appreciate that. So as Lee said, yeah, I kind of run our research partner team here over in EMEA. And I'm focused on just helping our customers like mature what they do and do better research. And all my background is in UX research, and I ran a research team prior to this. And I'm just really passionate around trying to help organizations get to that point. And that's kind of how Terry and I have worked over the last kind of year and a bit. And we're going to talk to you the journey that Terry and Gusto have kind of been on. And most of what will come from Terry today, and she's going to talk about all the things that that's kind of happened there throughout that kind of time, and some of their goals and everything that goes around how they want to mature kind of UX there. So to start off with, also actually just before I get started, just a reminder: put your questions in the Q&A as we go. That'd be really, really good. We want this to be, as interactive as possible. And there's going to be a lot of time at the end, to go through lots of questions. So please, chuck those in and we'll do our best to answer them at the end as well. To start off with, Terry, do you want to introduce yourself and give a bit of context as to kind of Gusto and what your role is there?
Sounds good. Hi, everyone. It's great to be here. Thanks for the introduction, Tom and Lee. So I'm Terry. I'm a product design manager at Gusto. Gusto, for those who don't know, is a recipe books company, subscription-based. and we are aiming to become the best way to eat dinner in the UK right now. I've been here for almost 3 years, which feels like a lifetime in some ways, because we've just seen so much change. We've grown rapidly over the past few years, and what the company was 3 years ago is completely different to what it's today, and I'm sure it's going to be completely different in another 3 years' time. In my 3 years at Gist, I've always been leading the design in our menu and discover tribe, which is all about choosing your recipes every single week, making sure that the choices that you are making are right for your family. And yeah, I think when I heard for the first time what this talk is going to be about, when I started to reflect on our user research journey at Gusto, I was thinking back to when I started. And when I started, there was no user research as part of the processes within the digital product team. I started, and about a second week in, we made sure that we are chatting to customers. The gap was recognized. So it was recognized that it's a gap. And so it just needed somebody to start pushing. Folks, we need to start watching our customers, how they are using the product, to make sure that we are spotting all of the things that we could be improving, all of the problems that we need to focus on. And so we've started conducting a bunch of moderated user research sessions in an incredibly scrappy way. We've just done our best to get to customers as quickly as possible, and then plan to our best abilities for the user research sessions and just ran with them. And I think I have a really good example from those early days that demonstrates how just getting exposure to customers and having this direct contact with customers can have impact on the business as well. We just started to observe customers, how they use the menu, how do they choose the recipes every single week. And what we found discrepancies between the behaviors they demonstrated on the menu when they were choosing the recipes and what data and analytics is telling us. Data was telling us that our recommendations are performing incredibly well. Data was telling us that customers are picking recipes from the top of the recommended list of recipes. But what we've seen by watching customers, the behavior was first assessing all of the selection that was available to them. So scrolling all the way to the bottom of the recipe list and then all the way to the top, and only then starting to choose those recipes that were relevant or that they liked. And based on some of this qualitative insights that we've gained, we were able to simplify the menu experience and optimize it for task performance, optimize it so people were able to get through the choice and evaluate all that is on the menu faster. And we ran this experiment, and just this experiment alone hit all of our OKR targets for the quarter, which has really started to create a conversation around how important it is that the product team that is making the changes to the product every single day is exposed to how customers are using the product. So that is my introduction. Sorry if it was a bit lengthy.
Oh, that's good. That's good. It's really good to hear kind of like where you guys have come from and some of that early work you started doing. So what did you do next? What was the next step from where you were in that? So you've got that initial or starting to build some kind of cadence of talking to customers. I don't know how regular it was at that point and how it was structured and stuff, but where did you kind of go from there?
Yeah, I almost call this as like the year one. So we were ramping up the frequency at which we were speaking to customers, but it was very time consuming. So you were planning these really big moderated sessions with customers who would come to the office at the time. And we were just trying to utilize those customer exposures as much as possible. So what are all of the different questions that we want to be asking? What are all of the different tests that we want to be running with them? And it was very time consuming. So we actually weren't able to conduct as much user research as we would want to, and as fast as we would want to. And also, I guess, make sure that we are conducting it with the appropriate rigor. So, but the product team was getting exposure to customers. And in my mind, that was a huge achievement for the year one. But then as we were I guess, identifying those new problems of pace and rigor in particular, we knew that we have to address them. And we had a little bit of buy-in from the business at the time, because they started to see that user research can have direct impact on commercial outcomes. And so we started exploring tools like UserZoom, and we were doing little market analysis at the time, so usetesting.com as well. And we started to explore how tools like those could help us expand the toolkit that we can be using to conduct research in a more effective and agile way, as well as, I guess, reach more customers faster. So that's really when we started to work with you, and that's helped massively to step change how we were conducting research.
And so that, I guess, that idea of pace was a big thing, right? Like aligning yourself to how the business wants to work, aligning yourself to things like development cycles, I presume, I guess cycles of your roadmap, like however you were looking to kind of deliver things to your customers at that point. What was it that about that shift in pace, like what kind of changes did that bring to the way you guys are using research, or even some of the successes or kind of the gains you made from being able to shift to that way of working?
Yeah, no, I think there's a few points to make. So the first one, with a tool like UserZoom, you get a breadth of methodologies at your fingertips, and you can launch these studies and almost forget about them. So you do have to invest a lot of effort into planning them, make sure you're asking the right questions, and that you can make the right decisions when you get the insights back. But you launch the study and it concludes on its own, and you're getting time back. So it's allowed us to gain insights, but also get a time back to maybe shift that focus into more rigorous planning of user research, or also focus on a little bit more generative research, as well as conducting usability evaluative research on the side. So I think that's where the pace was incredibly impactful. Secondly, we were getting insights back much faster and they were already analyzed in a better way than when you are conducting only moderated user research. And even your usability studies, you have to analyze what the actual results at the back of all of those studies are. So we were getting insights back faster, and they were already analyzed to a level that we were able to just share or use. And that meant that we were able to iterate much faster. So we are now at a place that we can launch a study, get results back, iterate straight away, and maybe launch 3 studies in the space of a day or 2 to significantly improve how we are thinking about the solutions that we are building.
I guess it's that a lot of people talk about when you are starting out, when you're starting to build, when you're starting to ideate and come up with different solutions, different ways to tackle things, different ways to view a problem, the more ways that you can expand that kind of view at the start, the more likely you're going to create the right solution to solve the right problems, right? Like down the way. Do you think people in the business were kind of buying into that way of working more, like as this time has kind of gone by? Like you talked about the product owners getting exposed to a bit of research at the start. What did that do to that level of exposure, and did it go beyond there as well?
Yeah, so I think, again, it's like two points to make. One is we needed the buy-in from the digital product team. Like the whole product team, we need to be having direct exposure to our customers. That is our mantra, and that's what we were really trying to ignite within the function. And by getting exposure to insights from customers more frequently and faster, inherently is going to do that. And we were doing some other initiatives on the side, like reading user research books together, running book clubs and so on, to make sure that we really keep this momentum high and that everybody understands why this is so crucial to how we want to build products at Gusto. But then secondly, and I think you're touching on it by saying, what about the beyond, is the rest of the functions. So a lot of functions at Gusto operate differently to how we do in digital product, where everything is very fast-paced, very agile, very iterative. And But the fact that we were suddenly able to conduct research at the larger scale proved that we are getting insights not from just one, Dorothy from Liverpool, and taking that opinion to shape our decisions on how we build the product was, I think, the first insight of how we are shifting the perception of user research at Gusto. But it was just the beginning, and I don't think we've properly cracked that just yet either.
No, and I think this is always a hard thing for anyone. I think every researcher has been in that room where someone has challenged on the basis of small sample sizes, or even, never been really bought into the approach or what we were doing to begin with. So anything that does come out of that, there's always that kind of, well, it was just this, or maybe this was what affected it. And it's interesting. I think we still even see it. I see it with a lot of organizations now, even ones that have been going for a while, that actually people are much more readily available or readily kind of able to jump to the reasons why that might not be right, rather than try and think about how this could shift their opinion or their change of their view of whatever it is that they're doing. Sounds like at Gusto, you've created. I don't know if we lost me or you there for a second, but I don't know if at Gusto it sounds like you've created enough exposure that people are just starting to really think about the user more and more and more as time kind of goes by. Those other areas of the business, now this is something, so Terry and I, we ran a maturity assessment, didn't we, on kind of Gusto, and we spoke to different people across the business. We ran some surveys. We kind of looked at the ins and outs of how research is being done. And one of the things that did pop up was kind of that disconnect between tech and non-tech. And the tech guys, like you say, you seem to have done a great job of getting everyone on board, but there was definitely a disconnect with the rest of the business. What are your plans for moving that onward and trying to get more buy-in from outside of tech? And how much do you think that's important to what you guys want to achieve in the long run?
Yeah, well, it's incredibly important because unless we all are bought into what we're doing and how we are approaching certain things, we will always move slower. So I think it is super important. I think what we are, I guess the problem in some ways is that we have very different ways of working, how we operate in digital product and some of the other functions. For example, we have a very well-established insights function at Gusto who are brilliant researchers, and they do fantastic work. Their work, however, influences more of the overarching Gusto proposition, the physical product evolution, and so on, rather than, I guess, conducting research that is granular enough that would be helping us to identify what might be the problems and opportunities to improve the digital product. But we have to work with them because they do gather really important insights that we do have to use. And so I think just surfacing a bit better what are all of these different ways of working will be an important first step. And I think it's quite a low-hanging fruit that we can tackle really quickly. And secondly, and I think that's a big one for me for this year, is really ensuring that we are surfacing and improving and surfacing the rigor that we are injecting into how we are conducting research. They are research professionals with so many years of experience in research and doing research right. We have to step up the game in how we are talking about research, how we are conducting it, how we are talking about how we've planned it, and how really we've thought about what the questions are that we are asking and what decisions it influenced. And that's twofold: making sure that the rigor is there and we have to do work to make sure that it is better, and that we are also talking about it in a meaningful way so it's recognized by the functions and the way that they operate and think.
Yeah, I think that's a really astute thing to look to try and achieve, isn't it? There's that idea of just trying to bring people along, but also be able to ensure that research can stand up and be like, no, we know what we're doing. This is done in a particular way. This isn't like say that start stage that you had, which was we just talked to a few people about this thing. It's moving beyond that, and that's great for, like you say, exposure and stuff. But it's trying to move to something where there's more rigor there. What about for those people that are trying to get the ball moving with that idea of exposure across your whole product teams? Because I think this is really interesting. we hear a lot, and I work with a lot of businesses that their research is done very much within teams, within individuals. It's almost, they get a lot of pushback from a PM ever wanting to do research themselves. Like that would never cross their mind, right? There are organizations out there as well that obviously have, have researchers, and they would never have a designer do a piece of research. Where does this kind of idea fit in, and what advice would you give to people to kind of help move to this mentality that you seem to have at Gusto?
Well, I think it is a mentality. Like for me, it's a non-negotiable. The mantra of every single person who's making changes to the product needs to be having direct contact with the customers, and that's where everything has started. And even when you do not have that rigor going into planning the research, why are you doing it? You are still, by just observing people using your product, you are building the intuition muscle, and you will be able to make better decisions every single day if you have the empathy for what are the problems that your customers are experiencing. So like for me, that's always the most important step. Just get going, get talking to customers. If for some reasons you can't, because it's very difficult to reach your users, there's always guerrilla testing that you could be doing. Who's the lookalike customer that you could reach out to and speak to? Like, speak to customers and see how they are using the product. For me, that's just the most important thing. And I don't know if I remember what was the follow-up question on that.
Oh, have you got any advice, I guess, for people trying to convince, some of those people that just aren't like that? How could they influence people like designers, product managers? Is there anything else that they could do there?
Yeah, I'm gonna be the wrong person to ask, because what we did those 3 years ago, and it worked then, and I'm not even sure if it would work now for us. We asked for forgiveness. We reached out to customers, we spoke to them. We then told stories of how user research influenced the solution that then made that commercial impact, and really made sure that when we did get that impact at the end, we didn't just say, oh my god, like we did this, and in terms of the design changes, and this was the outcome. We made sure that we are talking about from the very beginning, we've spoken to this many users, and these were the insights, and this how it shaped what we were thinking about in terms of opportunities. And I think that's really influenced and shifted the perception then already, even though we still had a lot of work to do.
Yeah, no, I don't think that's. I hope that would work. I mean, I think that's such a powerful thing, like showing the steps, showing where these decisions came from, being able to actually say, no, look, we made decisions based off this, and pushing that through is such a powerful thing. I think there's always that question anyone I speak to about like proving the value of research, and it's like, well, it made us make better decisions. It made us not do things wrong. It made us, it prevented that risk of creating the wrong thing. So it's like, how do you quantify that? Sometimes it's very, very difficult. But I think you talking about stories is a really, good way to think about that. Like the more you kind of tell this, people remember stories, right? We all know this from research and kind of, how people like to think about things. Stories are a great way. And I think that's an interesting way to approach it as well, definitely.
The only other thing that I just thought about that have actually helped me convince a few people recently, and I've only just started talking about it in such a way, is the intuition piece. Like you have to have the right intuition and empathy for your customers to make best decisions. And you will then have to do additional research or get those insights from wherever it is coming from in your company. But you have to have a good intuition also as a product person. And again, when I say product, I mean the product trio. And you won't have it unless you have that exposure to customers. And this phrase have helped me convince a few people recently. So maybe that's another one, that it's not just about that like hard inside specific one at the end of the research. It's that continuous exposure, building that intuition muscle. Yeah.
It's the unconscious incompetence going through to conscious incompetence, going through to I always get this last bit right. Unconscious competence, and so forth. So it's moving through those that way of competency, right? Like if you don't know that you enough about your user, you won't know you're making wrong decisions. You won't know that you haven't thought about the way this would affect their life, the way that they tend to use this product in their own homes, the way that they would do whatever that might be, right? They're the things that hopefully just make you constantly make better decisions, but also ask when you're not making decisions based on knowledge or not, right? And I think that's probably a huge part. It's really interesting. What's next? So, you know, with scaling things as they go at the moment, what's the kind of next steps? I know you mentioned rigor. What's the plan there, and what are you going to do to ensure that that is a really important part of what you're doing next?
Yeah. So, I mean, I guess, so if you look at the story, the year one was the scrappy, get the exposure. The year two is getting the pace and a little bit of rigor. And we are now at the stage where we have a big team. It's 14 of us in the product design team alone. I was counting it earlier when I was trying to get this number right, and I can't believe it, because when I started, it was 3 of us. So it's a massive shift to how we operate as a team. The shared understanding no longer works. It's too many of us. We have to start introducing some guidance and some documentation and codification of how we like to do research. What does best practice look like? So there's going to be a lot of that, a little bit of rigor into the process as well, governance for how we recruit customers, are we reaching the right customers for the types of studies that we are conducting, and so on. So it all feels very boring, but there's a lot of these little foundational steps that I think we have to invest into. And secondly, you mentioned that we've conducted the user research maturity assessment at the back of last year, which have really helped us. It was one of the inputs into a case to spin up a dedicated user research function. So we now are in a place where we have a principal user researcher who joined 2 weeks ago now, I think. She's fantastic. I'm so excited. Already having a huge impact on how we think about research. Up until then, we're like, yeah, we're doing good. Now we are rolling back a little.
Yeah.
But she's already helping us, define how to really mature and improve those processes and add a little bit of rigor and holistic understanding of what best practice looks like. And then past this hygiene almost, we are doing research, fantastic. We are doing a good job of especially evaluative research. So we have a well-defined problem. We've come up with a few solutions that we want to test. Evaluating those, I think we are doing a good job of, and iterating throughout and so on. Where we've not been able to do a good enough job, mainly because of resources and time, and to look past this very tactical research that we do to really understand what are some of the bigger problems that we could be tackling, maybe beyond even or outside of our problem space that we are operating within, that would help us innovate at the back of it. And I think having a dedicated user research function is key for that. Like I can see that by working with you, by working with Pretty now for the past 2 weeks. You folks just have such a more robust understanding of what needs to be done, that I hope that she will help us achieve that, look past the tactical and understand the bigger problems.
Yeah, no, it's really, really, really good to hear that, obviously, for one, but it's, I was actually chatting very briefly to Lee, who's just showing his face here again, about like the idea of strategic research and moving into it. And actually one of the, I think, things that helps with strategic research is not just about running particular pieces of research that are there to inform a particular decision early on, but it's actually you doing that piece around getting everyone to know the customer more, think about the customer more, embed it with them. That's almost getting people to think strategically all of the time, right? And it's that idea of culture shift, decision shift. Like that's almost like the starting basis of it. And now you'll have someone who can bring the research in where everyone will buy into it and love it and hopefully take it on. But anyway, Lee, have you got some questions for us?
We have got absolutely loads of questions, and there won't be time to answer them now, but we'll try and follow those up. Answer all of them now. We'll do a couple. In fact, you've just answered one there, which was from Travis about strategic research versus research that validates design. So thank you. That's great. We'll try and follow up as many as we can through email as well. But I'm going to read some out now. So either or both of you just take these over the next few minutes. So thanks everyone that's been asking lots and lots of questions. So there's one from Megan that I think I think you've kind of touched on quite a lot, but it'd be interesting to hear your maybe tips, Terry, around. Megan says, I love the idea of the whole product team being involved and that being part of the culture. But how did you get there? Do you know what I mean? Can you talk about that, getting that buy-in a little bit more? Because that's probably, in my view, one of the hardest things.
Yeah, I mean, again, I'm reflecting back on the 3 years ago when I was a designer, part of a squad embedded, and me having the non-negotiable kind of mentality that needs to happen within the squad. The whole squad needs to have exposure to direct to customers. And so it started with me running user research and sharing. I think I started to share as much as possible, like whatever I've learned about the customers, whatever insights I've gained, whatever questions I've had, I've started sharing it. I started sharing pictures, I started sharing little snippets of videos, and always encouraging people to join. So making sure that it is set up for people to join and observe these sessions. And sharing in Slack, we use Slack. What are the times that you can join? What do you think you can learn? And alleviating that ambiguity over what they should be doing there. So like, you are there because we are all building this intuition muscle. I would be banging on about it on and on.
No, totally get it. And actually, when we introduce Steve Portugal in a moment, he's going to have some top tips, I think, around that very subject as well. So that'll be great. Thank you. We've got time probably for one or two more questions. There was a great one here. I'm just navigating the interface here. This was from Daniel. So he's standing up a new team. He's looking for resource and budget for testing, but it's being questioned by the organization. Should the organization invest? And any advice, and I think you've touched upon it when you talked about maturity model, but any advice on approaches that have worked? So for you, Terry, directly, and Tom, maybe for some customers that you've worked with to help kind of secure internal budget. It's like the big perennial question, of course, and we could do a few hours on it, but you've got 2 minutes.
You might be better off answering this, Tom, because you've got better exposure, and then I can add in if there is anything that you've not covered.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, that's the big one, isn't it? Like, how do I actually do that? I think a lot of it is, I think there's a huge part, which again kind of links to what you've been talking about already, Terry, around like building the culture of it. Like, the more and more people expect it, the more and more people want to see it, the more they start using it in place, all these things. It just becomes thing that is a necessity as like anything else. And you need to think is as much ways as possible to build necessity for user research, reflecting upon projects that might have happened where we made mistakes. There might be like the idea of looking at, case studies where we built things that were just the wrong thing to build. All that type of stuff is great if you can ever tie financial aspects to it and all those kind of things as well. But I do, the big thing that we obviously did, with you at Gusto and we've done with other customers is around, that idea of really demonstrating like, this is where we are from a research maturity perspective. This is how far we have to go as well. Like, there's all this other area, there's all these other things that we're doing, but here are also things that are likely happening off the back of where we sit from a maturity perspective. Like, it's very easy to talk to many of the people out there and to talk about, what things were happening in the background because of all of the ways they were going about producing products, and doing things from a UX perspective. Terry, I think you're the best to. I mean, if you want to hear about your experience, I think it'd be best to hear from you as well.
If this is like starting from scratch completely, there is no user research budget at all for tools for user researchers, then it's a slightly different problem, and it almost depends on the company culture and what is its vision. Like at Gusto, they keep telling us that they want to be, the best tech team there is and the best tech company out there. And, a lot of companies do that. They have these like vision statements to rally internal people around. Lean on it. There is, the best companies out there do have user research budget and functions and do user research. And there is so much stats these days around how other companies have benefited from user research. So I would just populate as much of it as possible go and lean on that if I was starting from scratch. I don't know if it would work, but it's what I would do if I was in.
Okay, well, I get the sense that we'll have a BetterUX summit on this topic alone, basically, and we've got some content coming later in the year that should really help people with this topic as well. So I'm going to, because I know that Steve Portugal is desperate to get started. I want to thank you, Terry, for joining us today and sharing your story and journey. Thank you very much. Tom, as ever, thank you so much again. Let's thank you both. And you guys can turn your cameras off now if you want. And I'll ask Steve Portugal, who needs no introduction, but I am going to give him an introduction. So just to say, Steve, it's an absolute delight that you could make it today. And we're all super excited about your session, which is going to be looking specifically at impact. Over the years, I've been in a room with you. I know you didn't know I was in that room, but I was. By the way, they were conferences. Don't worry, you don't have to check your security system or anything like that. I'm not there now. Don't worry. Yeah. But thank you so much for joining us. And I'll just kind of hand over to you and to take it away. Thank you.
Great, and thanks for telling everyone how desperate I am. That's nothing like desperation to set one up for just a really successful, calm presentation. I am desperate, but we're going to get going here anyway. So thanks, everyone. Thanks for everyone for having me and for all the discussion so far. Yeah, so I'm going to talk a little bit about boosting user research impact, a phrase which is sort of lurking around everything we've been talking about already, and then we'll have some time for questions after that. And I want to point you to 3 things before we get going. I'm going to reference 2 of them, so just some context. A couple of books I've written, and Interviewing Users in particular has some resources available on the book page, and I'm going to reference a couple of them. So when I say that, it'll be this URL. You can also find it just by Googling me in this book. And I'm also going to, at least in a couple of slides, quote briefly from a podcast that I have, Dollars to Donuts, which is where I've been interviewing people that are in research leadership roles and getting some of their best practices and experiences. All right, so an oversimplified framework, but I think will help us for our time today to talk about the ways in which we can drive the impact or support it or boost it of research. And just I'm using this idea here of what do we do before we do research, what do we do during research, and what can we do after? And then, of course, because I'll have a little appendix after that as well of things that we're not going to quite get to here. All right, so before research. So here we're kind of talking about what research are we going to do? There's a lot of different processes here. But I liked this example that Laith Ulubi, who at the time was at Udemy, was talking about a quarterly planning process that the research team would go through. And it was in conjunction with the quarterly OKRs that the product teams and so on were doing. And so it let the researchers look at what was coming up and then propose some ideal research asks, or in this case, I guess, offers over, and they were doing this quarterly, and then coming up with an overall proposal of here's the research that we're going to engage in, and then giving that to leadership. And if I remember, they reserved some capacity for things that emerged, but trying to get here, I think the key here, and to me, this is a shift in maturity for research, is when you go from being reactive, like things come over the transom and you try to accomplish them within timeframes, to being proactive, where you take some ownership of, hey, here's what the work that the business is doing, here's the research work that we're proposing to support that. And this is, I think, a big shift. So that's designed for the stakeholders here, but this is kind of, you can contrast this with something that Justin Threlkeld describes, and it's creating a living document to capture open questions. So this is inward facing for the research team. It's not really a resource for stakeholders, but think about capturing the questions that come up or that you observe have come up, the gaps, the unknowns, and that when this seems to be a way that research teams can be more successful and effective in dealing with stakeholders in terms of conceiving of or planning research. This is from something that Salesforce wrote about. They created just the most rudimentary tracker of what they had learned. And even in this case, what recommendations they made. Because when things come up, hey, do we know this? We want to do this research. One way that research teams add value is to be able to say like, oh, we already know that. We have that information. Let us get that to you. Which of course means being in those meetings, having access to those conversations, but also being able to track. And Terry was kind of talking about just the growth, growth in processes, growth in information, and you soon find yourself sitting on top of a lot of stuff. And so even just some way to kind of organize, and I think this is so simple, and you can see kind of how effective it would be. I think you see things like, I know Atlassian was looking for a reference librarian. I've seen other job postings for this, that there's a person whose job it is to sit with this material and sit with the people that need it and look this up and kind of make connections. It speaks to this larger dream, I think, of the research repository. And I think this is a huge topic. And like with everything, I think we hope we can just like turn on a piece of software and solve it. I think sometimes we look for the solution without asking ourselves these harder questions, some of which I have kind of, brainstormed here, but think about who's putting information in, who's putting information out, pulling it out, when, what kind of information is going to be used, and how you can integrate that into the research that you are doing. So these are a lot of questions to answer. This is not straightforward. Thinking about a specific study itself, like what are we going to learn in this research? There's a format that others have developed calling like a questions workshop. And so here's just the kind of the assignment that I used in a workshop I did last year. And we asked people just to get together in a Zoom room and gave them some time to kind of put things into the spreadsheet, and then we talked about it. And one thing to point out, just in the column headings here, I asked for decision before I asked for question. So what are you going to do is a more important input that I wanted from this group of stakeholders versus what thing you want to know. Because people start throwing out random questions, things that they're curious about. But what we're trying to drive to in terms of prioritizing is like, what information is important for the work that you have to do? And we did this with one group of stakeholders and then synthesized it, then presented it out to a second group of stakeholders to kind of get their builds and their input. And, of course, the best laid plans, I think go awry in interesting ways. And so the last time I did this, we were focusing on a new community that the team didn't know anything about, but we got totally hung up on, well, who is in this community? What is this community? And it was really productive, of course, to facilitate this conversation. And we, the researchers, we didn't know that the team didn't know this answer. We thought this was assumed. So sometimes this facilitation uncovers, important things to resolve. Like I said, we showed this to a second group. The output, we showed it to a second group. And what we found out there was they're already building something. So they tried to kind of add questions that were more evaluative, but that's not what the kind of the sponsored initiative was. So we didn't know they were building something. And so these are sort of problems, but they're also things that you wouldn't have uncovered otherwise. And so there was some sort of adjacent value to even just facilitating this conversation. Here's an example of a resource that is on the interviewing users page that I mentioned earlier. I spent years being frustrated a little bit, or even just surprised when people showed up to participate in fieldwork and they didn't automatically know how I wanted them to participate. So I created a very, very brief training, and training, you could put that in air quotes. And obviously my clients and probably lots of you all invest in building up people's skills. So I'm not really talking about that. I'm talking about like a cheat sheet, a one pager with a 15-minute conversation just to help them set expectations and help them be effective and successful in this setting. Okay, now we're going to switch to what happens during research. And so here's just I redacted all the details here, but this is just from one of the organizations I've been working with. They have a dedicated and very talented research ops person. And one of the things they're great at is making all the tools work together. So they have some mechanism for recruiting and scheduling participants with a lot of pieces joined together. And when they do that, it automatically creates a second calendar invite that anyone can attend. But what they attend is a streaming version of the Google Meet call. They're not going to be invited to the call with the researchers and the participants. So there's two calls that mirror each other. I've seen someone do this where the participant was in Zoom, but given who the client was, the digital backroom was in WebEx. But they took someone who was separate from the researcher. They took another person to kind of join all these meetings and make all this work. And so we were talking previously, Terry was talking about, ways to sell this and get engagement. And so some of it, to add to what was being discussed, some of it is like building these sort of infrastructure to make it available, and having this larger group. And so there is some infrastructure, but there's also some advocacy and kind of evangelism here. So you might have a Slack channel or some kind of chat where, again, this digital back room where people are, but ideally you have a dedicated person sitting in that room to monitor the questions. And that's not really feasible, I think, in the best situation, to have the researcher being present in the interview with the participant and then kind of going out of that room digitally into this other room. Because sometimes what you see in those rooms is just chatter. Oh, this is interesting. Oh, this is interesting. As well as like, hey, I have a question. So it takes some person power to monitor that and kind of facilitate that. So now you're kind of adding the effort to do this in order to get this outcome, which is this engagement. It also takes promotion, like reaching out to individual people to remind them directly, reminding people in a group chat that, hey, this interview is happening today, or this interview starting in 5 minutes. Even having somebody in the back room, not just to monitor, but to facilitate and engage. When we've had researchers sitting in this Slack chat, we're kind of modeling for non-researchers what kind of reflection and what kind of on-the-fly synthesis is useful. I think the anti-pattern here is when you have people in this room that are kind of micromanaging the interview itself. And I have seen this happen where they were just really like telling the researcher, move on here, move on there. That's we want you to talk about this. We want you to talk about that. I think that is more about kind of the culture and expectations about what researchers' role is, and probably out of scope for our time today, but just think about those factors as well. Another resource you can pull off that website is a debriefing worksheet. I'm sorry. I think it's actually less important what's on the worksheet than just creating the expectation or the opportunity that there's, we should talk about this. Hey, if you're going to attend, leave time for debriefing afterwards. So the worksheet kind of formalizes that, but so does just putting it on the calendar and inviting everybody. And you can do things like let stakeholders who attend share what they thought, or what they're confused by, or what they're excited by, or let the researcher kind of improv. And I say synthesize, but very roughly just kind of talk about what they were thinking and just provide some visibility into that process. Here's, I think, a really effective and kind of quick thing, but you have to be intentional about it. I call these like fieldwork highlights or field highlights. This is a time-boxed activity. So the researcher, after each session, or maybe at the end of the day, writes up almost a stream of consciousness description of what happened. And I think there's an important what you do and what you don't do. This is describing, here's this, we saw that. What you're not doing here is saying, here's a pattern, here's a conclusion, here's an inference, here's a recommendation of what we should do. You're just describing that person. So, as the researcher, we should spend like at most 5 minutes doing this. It goes in a Slack, in a thread, or it goes in a Google Doc that is, constantly updated, or an email thread. It's there to kind of create some stories about who we've met, and kind of, primes the pump, paves the path a little bit for everyone to get some exposure to this. This always seems like it's going to be risky because it's not actionable and it's not conclusive. But boy, this gets people excited. It's low effort for them. It's low effort for me to produce. So I highly recommend this. And the last piece of sort of during is a top line summary. So not a full report, not a full analysis and synthesis, but kind of collating what are the themes and patterns and topics. Even if we don't have conclusions about these topics, what are some things that we're hearing about? The expectation here is we're going to do a deeper analysis and synthesis and reporting here. But for now, hey, we just did all this research. We just very quickly finished. Here's kind of what's top of mind for us. Let's talk this through and see where you're excited, where you're challenged, where you disagree, where you don't understand. And then we can kind of, this is almost like a wireframe for the synthesis. We can kind of test a prototype and then see where we kind of need to build further work into. All right, so moving into the after portion. So what happens with the research output or deliverables? I think MailChimp has changed this in the time since I heard this, but at one point they had this very standard 3 outputs for every research study. The first was an email that went out to some group with all the key points summarized. So here's the top 10 things, that's it. The second was a deck, a keynote or a PowerPoint, and they would schedule these, team presentations, but also lunch and learns. And then the third was a raw archive of all the data so that anyone could go back to it. And they did it in Evernote. I think they outgrew Evernote a few years ago and have a different content management system. But this idea that there's this hierarchy, these facets that are for different people, different use cases, and they're trying to sort of serve all the expectations and not just arrive at one. When it's possible, and maybe this feels old-fashioned to me, but I think I guess I want to sort of carry the torch for this. Having a workshop after research is finished, I think is, this is an offline example, from a previous era of work that is, this was a 2-day offsite that a client may arrange for. They booked an offsite facility to get everybody out of the office. They had my team and I there. There's a non-trivial investment, but we explored the specific possibilities of how they could act on what was learned in the research. But this was a great moment of knowledge transfer. They ended up owning the findings because they internalized them, because they spent a lot of focused and creative time trying to apply the findings. And this notion of knowledge transfer, right, I think it's one of the biggest gaps between researchers and our stakeholders and our teams. I think this workshop, and it doesn't have to be the scale, but it's a great way to try to make that happen successfully. And I guess my caution here, or my overall advice, is separating the what we learned session from the what we should do session, or what should we do session. These are very different mindsets and sort of different kinds of experiences, and you want to keep them, I think, as separate as possible. Even if you don't do a workshop like that, I think there's just tremendous kind of alignment power. There are so many meetings that we get into where we say the same things over and over again. I think this, I tried this, oh, so-and-so tried that. When you bring in a point of view that has been synthesized, especially when your collaborators and stakeholders are involved in helping you do the synthesis, then you can kind of point outwards. It's not just what are the same things we're always saying and we're kind of stuck on, but hey, we have this external information. And so thinking about these people, thinking about what they said, thinking about what they want, I think it's just really a significant way to shift the conversation. And so, a big gap in the work after the research, right, is how do we organize and assign what happens next? And so one of my clients is a program manager, not a researcher, but what she has done is sat with the output from the work that I'm doing, the report, and categorizes findings. So implications and questions, and assigns them to different work groups. She really facilitates this handover. And so there's this, things like, hey, here's what work stream this should apply to. So we had all these work streams kind of being brought in, and she was just tagging them like, this question is for you, this question is for you. It would be hard for me to do that as a researcher and as an external, but to have kind of my gatekeeper clients really handle all that, it was really a brilliant way to kind of address the what happens next, kind of now what. We talked a little in the last session about kind of culture. I think there's some fun and creative things to do to move culture. This was from LinkedIn. They would do a field day. It was kind of modeled after Hack Day. Once a quarter, they would go and talk to users. They would just have a topic, and they'd bring people from across the country, and they'd bring the company and bring researchers in and kind of set up a very operationalized program to go talk with people. If you participated in 4 of these, you got a lab coat. And so this is just kind of making it fun, but also the lab coat's very visible, right? There's kind of a ritual to it, but there's a symbol to it. You could display this, when you're working in the office in that time period, you could display this and people would see it and ask questions about it. And so, there is kind of some theories about culture change is to do things. One way to create culture change is to tell stories. Another way to create culture change is to do things that get other people to tell stories. And you're telling stories about the culture you want to have. So this lab coat is a simple example of a way to do that. MailChimp, again, they built up a marketing team for research. So Atlassian's kind of having a research librarian to interface. Marketing is kind of, and MailChimp is kind of creating awareness and kind of celebrating kind of a fun way. So designing these aviator style jackets and putting badges on them. They created an in-house podcast and then put up posters that were kind of very demographically targeted as a way to kind of raise awareness about this. So they're really having fun and being creative. And you can just see like, oh, this is how marketing people might think, but maybe researchers wouldn't think like this. So I think there's just so many options available to us around kind of doing this. So just, as almost an appendix here, I said I'd talk about before, during, and after, and then this sort of miscellaneous section is around sort of the maturity topic and culture topic that Tom and Terry were kind of, and Lee as well, were kind of talking about. And so it's just thinking about, there's many more of these. I'm just going to pick one for us today, given our time, and we want to get to questions. It's just thinking about sort of structure. So, one thing that Salesforce talked about, I thought was, potentially very effective. Instead of just saying stakeholders and thinking about that as kind of a monolith, or saying like, teams don't, or stakeholders don't, and sort of seeing this barrier is to segment. And so they took the factors of interest and influence, and then they mapped them. Then they looked at this graph, and so they made some tactical decisions about, hey, we're going to segment our stakeholders, and then we decided as the Salesforce research team, how do we want to manage or work with or engage with these different stakeholders? So I think for you, your axes could vary. It might not be influence and interest, but I think that's a very good starting place. But you might label these quadrants differently in terms of what you want to do. But I think, again, taking what is a monolith and then breaking it down and then choosing your tactics, appropriately, I think is really just a lovely way to kind of break down what can feel overwhelming. How do I want to work with these specific folks based on in terms of how I think, we're going to drive the impact that we're looking for. All right, that's what I have time for today. So let's shift over to questions.
Yes. Hey, Steve, thank you. Thank you so much. There is so much that there's a bunch of questions. There's a lot that are to do with like the technicalities of streaming and live streaming. And I think we'll try and take those offline. That I'd rather we focus on some other questions. There is one that's come in, which is from Jane, which is, what is the researcher's role in ensuring that organizations take the results of research and act on them? And I think you've touched on some of that, but yeah, I'd be interested to get your view on that. Thank you.
I think, I think it's research leadership's role to do that. Mm-hmm. I mean, the fact that we can even say research leadership, goes back to one of your first slides, Lee, sure, about just the state of the practice, right? There was no research leadership if you went back X years. Mm-hmm. Research kind of reported up to different functions. And for me, that actually was the impetus to doing the podcast, was like, let's get these stories about research leadership. People where companies have said, hey, this is a function we believe in. This is a team. We need the title. We need the leadership. That's leadership's job, right? Is to advocate for the function. For individual contributor researchers there who don't have that kind of leadership, and that's a point on the maturity spectrum, right? Is like,
isn't it? Yeah.
There are some ICs, they are change agents. Sometimes those people end up becoming leaders, but those are people that are pushing uphill. And I mean, I have so much admiration for that. It takes a lot of passion, but it's hard to be a change agent without the empowerment to be the change agent. So yes, find advocates and so on. But when you have that support from higher up, I think it's just going to go. So the short answer is yes, it's the responsibility, but it's the responsibility of research leadership. And I think researchers can, be allies and supporters and advocates for that. But if you don't have you can't be in the meetings, you don't have the title, you don't have the access. You have to be realistic about what you can do.
Of course you do. And you might have some influence, of course, and you might build up personal relationships, or you might be uncompromising, like Terry said she was within her squad as well. But yeah, I totally agree with that. You kind of need, it's not just that your own functions leadership behind it, you need all of leadership really behind it. That this is part of what we are. Maybe this is part of that bigger strategic piece of just a desire to be customer centric, for instance. Yeah, totally good. We probably only have time for one more question, and this is from Kamala, and we'll try and answer more questions in a follow-up email as well. So I think she might have asked this just before you did the LinkedIn coat example, but what amazing fun ideas do you have to transfer knowledge to cross-functional teams? I'd love to know how to effectively workshop UX research insights. So I think you definitely touched on a lot of that, but any more fun examples of how to do it?
And I showed that picture of the messy room with all the sheets written up. I mean, that was a how might we workshop, right? And just to be jargony about it, I mean, that was a workshop where we took all the research and boiled it down to 4 or 5 key questions, opportunities, and you can get a little jargony here. Opportunities are like a way we might see the world as being different for our users based on the research. Opportunities are not about the business, they're about the kinds of experience. And so this is a distillation of the research, so like 5 key questions or 10 or 3, and then getting together and saying, how might we do this? Bringing a cross-functional group in, giving people permission to think divergently. So that's the power of how might we. There's like many, you can go read about how might we. It doesn't say how will we, it says like, let's just explore all the possibilities. So you diverge and then you converge. And so you give people a lot of permission to be silly, to be creative, to come up with bad ideas. And so it does knowledge transfer because people are engaging with this in ways that they hadn't even seen the possibilities. And it sets them off with things that they could do that they didn't even think that they could do. So it can be really, really fun and creative, and you laugh and you're silly, but you come up with some really interesting and exciting stuff.
And it should be done off-site, COVID permitting, of course. And I love the way that throughout this, there's that separation of what do we learn and then what do we do. I think you know what I mean. Those too easy. Do we go from like insight to solution, insight solution, insight solution, and that's not. Often it's like insight, reflection, discussion. What does it really mean? More insight, I think, is often when we get to really good solutions at the end of that.
Beautiful, well put.
Okay. Steve, thank you so much. We're going to share some of the resources that you've mentioned when we send the follow-up email. Thank you so much for joining us. I was desperate to hear from you, actually. So thank you so much, and hopefully see you again sometime soon. So that's about all we've got time for today. And this is thanks everyone who's spoken today. And thanks everyone who's come along and listened. Of course, there will be a follow-up email. We've got a lovely survey to send you as well. We'd really like to know what kind of content that you want in future summits. So that could be driven by you. Give us feedback, tell us how to improve. Yeah, keep your eye out for the recording that we'll send out. We're just ending like a couple of minutes early. Isn't that nice? We can all stretch our legs. And everybody have a great day. Thanks a lot for joining. See you on the next one. Bye-bye.
Recording stop.